Hello and welcome back to a new video. This is going to be something a little different where I'm going to be rating the albums of a band from best to worst, or from worst to best. This is something I've wanted to do for a while now. Back in the day I used to do these rate the artist videos. This was back when I was still transitioning away from being an angry reviewer, and I was trying to figure out what the channel direction was going to be. And it was basically a way for me to get quick hits. And it worked. People seemed to like the videos, but I never wanted to continue them because they just felt cheap. So this is a way for me to not feel cheap and to talk about some bands that I maybe won't do proper reviews of, but maybe I will. Who knows? Anyway, this is going to be King Crimson, worst to best. King Crimson are one of my favorite bands, as I think I've said maybe before. If I haven't, that's a statement. They'd be in my top 5. Love everything they've done to varying degrees. They don't have an album I hate, which is more than can be said for a lot of prog bands. They have an album I'm not the biggest fan of, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But I don't hate any of these albums, and maybe keep that in mind as you watch the video. So, my least favorite King Crimson album is The Construction of Light. I mean, what happened here, man? I mean, this is sandwiched between two albums that I love, you know. THRAK and The Power to Believe are both extremely worthy albums that, you know, just really carry the torch of King Crimson forward. Well, this one just seems willing to sort of slump in the background and sit there. I mean, this is definitely a King Crimson album for the nu metal era. You know, it has that kind of production sound to it. It doesn't actually have any nu metal-ish tracks on it. You know, you get to that when you get to Happy With What You Have to Be Happy With on The Power to Believe and the EP of the same name. But it has that production sound. I've heard that Fripp had been listening to Korn when he went during the process of making this album. That's an incredibly surreal mental image for me, but this album kind of sounds like it. And what isn't spoiled by the production is a little too backwards looking for me. Like, this is definitely King Crimson at their most backwards looking. You know, it's the 80s band plus not so great circa 2000 production, the V drums. It's an abnormally uninspired record from a band who are usually capable of so much more. There is great stuff on here. I love the title track, Lark's Tongues and Aspic Part 4, and even the Coda I Have a Dream, which is, it gets amazingly edgy at moments in time, but by the same token, I get where Adrian was coming from. That's the way I think most people who were paying attention probably would have felt at the time. But yeah, it's not a bad album, but it is my least favorite. So moving on, the next best King Crimson album is Lizard. This is another one sandwiched between two albums that I absolutely love, but it just doesn't quite pull it off. It's not a bad album. I don't dislike it the way I dislike The Construction of Light, but it's the odd one out in the Peter Sinfield post Court of the Crimson King trilogy. It's definitely they're incorporating jazz into the mix. You know, John Anderson does guest vocals on a track. I guess at one point there was some talk of Fripp joining Yes or Anderson joining King Crimson, which I think is fascinating. But on the whole, it's all over the place. I kind of wish John Anderson had sung on the whole album, to be honest with you, because the lead singer, Gordon Haskell, he does not believe what he's singing. He does not like the material he's singing one bit, and you can hear it in his voice. because it's not great. And Gordon Haskell's not a bad vocalist, but this album just you can tell he hated working on this album, and he split supposedly as soon as the sessions were done. But in spite of that, there's still some great material on here, you know. Indoor Games, Circus, Lady of the Dancing Water, and parts of the title track are amazing. You know, the title track of which is King Crimson's one entry into long-form prog sidelong epic land. But unfortunately, it's not one of the best King Crimson tracks. But yeah. Anyway, next album come to is Beat. This is another middle album of a trilogy. This is like a theme. Beat is definitely my favorite out of the bottom three. It's not a bad album. It's the weakest album of the 80s and the second weakest album they put out with Adrian Belew. And honestly, you know, this is one, another day, this could have been in the top 10. It's an album that has a lot of great songs, but the production drags it down a bit, and it just completely falls apart at the end because there's a long instrumental track at the end called Requiem, and they never really resolved the track. And what it winds up reminding me of a lot is some of Zappa's guitar stuff in the 80s, where he would just go on, and there'd be no resolution. And it's not a great track, and it brings down the album a lot for me, despite the fact that I don't hate it. But otherwise, you know, there's phenomenal stuff on here. You know, Neil and Jack and Me, Heartbeat, Sartori in Tangier, Waiting Man, The Howler, Neurotica. It's phenomenal stuff, but it's better live. And that's why I couldn't put this quite as high. Like, I have friends who will say that, you know, Absolute Lovers ruined the 80s stuff for them. Like, they cannot listen to the 80s stuff because it was so much better live. I don't get that for the rest of the 80s stuff, but I do kind of get it for Beat. And that's why it's as low as it is. The next album on the list, this is Islands. I did a review of this. This is a very underrated album, a very underappreciated album, and an extremely unique album within their discography. It feels like it's the least Fripp inflected piece they ever put out. You know, despite the fact that I'm sure he was extremely involved in the making of the album, it is the least characteristic of him. Because it's not about riffs and tangled, thorny structures that you have to really clear your way through and open your mind to process. It's more about cool, chill, jazzy moments and instrumental work that almost reminds you a little bit of post-rock at some moments in time. I'm not going to say any more because I did a full review, but it's definitely one of my favorites, and I would advise you to check it out. Next one, this is the most recent and probably the last King Crimson album. I think the current group is probably just, it's a way for Fripp to A, get some emotional resolution on King Crimson, and B, get himself some money for when he retires. The Power to Believe, 2003. This is one I know a lot of people swear by. A lot of people I know put this in their top 5. I am not convinced by it yet. It is extremely good, but I just don't like it as much as THRAK. And I don't really know why that is. The production is way better than The Construction of Light, but it's still maybe a little too modern for me. You know, I like that they incorporated more of what was good about the projects, which was one of the problems with The Construction of Light. You know, it felt like that weird, avant, experimental, almost improv style of the projects was sorely lacking on that album. But there's some of that here. There are some great tracks on here, and you know, it's a phenomenal phenomenal King Crimson album, and probably the last one we're ever going to get. Next album, this is probably going to be blasphemous to a lot of people that I'm putting this over the Power to Believe. Three of a Perfect Pair. I don't know about you, I love Three of a Perfect Pair. You know, I don't care that it's the closest King Crimson have ever come to selling out. You know, I don't care that there are tracks on here that could have gotten big airplay if the band had really wanted to. It's a phenomenal album. You got the title track, Sleepless, Model Man, you know, and then when you get on to the right side of the album, the second side, and you have that weird experimental stuff, you know, like Industry and Dig Me, and then Lark's Tongues and Aspic Part 3. It's a phenomenal album that I really wish people appreciated more. In the Wake of Poseidon, everybody says this is a clone of In the Court, and it is, sort of. Half of it is a clone of In the Court of the Crimson King, and then it does its own thing at the end, and it's fun, you know. It's a partial clone of one of the greatest albums of all time, so it's going to be pretty good, but it really doesn't hold up to In the Court. Even though I love a lot of what's on here, you know, Cat Food, In the Wake of Poseidon, Cadence and Cascade, and even like the Devil's Triangle, that's some great stuff. A sort of bootleg version of Holst's Mars, the Bringer of War, that they couldn't use the actual version of because Holst's estate wouldn't let them. So they just made a bootleg version of it, which sounds exactly the same. I don't know how they got away with it, but yeah. So this next one, these next two might be a little controversial. This is Starless and Bible Black. You know, weird deal, half live, half studio. Apparently at the time that wasn't known, and you know, people just thought it was a studio album. It's the first real taste of live King Crimson not recorded on a ham sandwich that most people ever got back in the day. Nowadays, some of that value's been washed away because we have like more King Crimson live albums than you can shake a stick at. You know, Robert Fripp clearly took a page from the Book of the Grateful Dead and was like, I'm going to release every King Crimson show that was ever recorded, and even a few that weren't. And he just ran with that. But, you know, this is still absolutely just beyond perfect, you know. You know, Lament, Starless and Bible Black, Fracture. Fracture is some of the craziest music to have come out of the prog scene. And especially like the Night Watch. For some reason the Night Watch has always stuck with me so deeply. And that weird, enigmatic expression on the back where there's this little thing, and in the middle it says, "This night wounds time," which is so creepy, but so cool. A lot of these albums I just don't have a whole lot to say about it because they're just phenomenal albums. So moving on with 1995, this one may be controversial too. This is THRAK. This is, to me, this is phenomenal. This is the only King Crimson album of the 90s. It's the last one to me that really clicked with me. You know, when I picked it up, obviously I was not buying King Crimson albums back when this came out, or even when the 2000s albums came out. I don't think I even really knew who King Crimson were until about 2010. This to me is like the last great King Crimson album. Like I said, at some point the Power to Believe will probably click with me. I'll probably revise that opinion. But for me, this is just the perfect blend of the old, heavy, just flying brick John Wetton era King Crimson with the more athletic, small, mobile, independent unit King Crimson. You have 6 members of the band, 2 of every instrument. I mean, this is not a nimble band. This was not a graceful band. This was a plodding, lumbering dinosaur of a group. I mean, the album even has a song named Dinosaur on it. And they're probably my second favorite live version of the band. So that kind of biases me here too. There's a lot of great stuff on here. Dinosaur, Vroom and Vroom Vroom, Walking on Air, People, the title track, and Baboom. Just great stuff. Highly, highly recommend it. So the next 4 after THRAK, after that one little curveball, the top 4 are obvious. You know, they are the 4 canonical King Crimson albums. And I'm going to open things up with Discipline. This is, you could easily say, don't speak to me or my son ever again. You could easily say that this is the best post-70s King Crimson album. It probably is. I think I would reach for THRAK and 3 of a Perfect Pair before I reached for this one, if only because this one I've heard this one so many times, but it is absolutely phenomenal. It is basically what this is this is very artsy new wave. You know, it's new wave with the instrumental proficiency and the weird sounds and whatnot cranked up to 11. It's very in debt to the Talking Heads on some level, but it's absolutely fantastic. And this is probably, you know, these top 4 are all like recommended listening if you want to be into like art rock and progressive rock. And yeah, probably the most recommended of the whole bunch, the most required. In the Court of the Crimson King. I mean, what is there to say about this? This is the album that arguably codified progressive rock as a genre. It's iconic in so many ways. You have the album cover, you have 21st Century Schizoid Man, you have the title track, Epitaph, I Talk to the Wind, Moonchild. I actually love the second half of Moonchild. I know everybody hates on it because it's just 10 minutes of like jazz noodling, but I think it's amazing, you know? That's how much of a fanboy I am of old school King Crimson. So moving on, we have, and these last 2 are really obvious now, you know, Red. This album is amazing. This is the last one they did with John Wetton. It's the last 70s King Crimson album. It's not refined. It's stripped down and the grunginess is turned up. It's almost more organic and less composed than the last 2 albums, or than the last 2 albums came across. And it really, it has a unique atmosphere and a distinct personality as an album because the band had more or less fallen to pieces. I believe David Cross had been forced out. I could be wrong about that, though. Jamie Muir was obviously long gone. The band themselves were, I guess, not doing well. Fripp was, I get the sense Fripp was just disillusioned with the music industry entirely. There's a lot of conflicting reasons have been given for why the original King Crimson broke up. And I mean original in the sense of an entity that had continuously existed in one form or another, uninterrupted, since the late 60s. But I think it was just the music industry. I think Fripp was a little sick about everything. But again, this is absolutely essential. I would say the 2 best things on here are the opening and closing tracks. You know, Red is just essential, and then Starless is probably the most beautiful thing this band ever did, and one of the rare things that indicate that they are actually capable of making something that tugs on the heartstrings as opposed to the mind strings, or whatever you want to call them. That metaphor that analogy did not work. Moving on. So the final King Crimson album, I think the best King Crimson album, Lark's Tongues and Aspic. This is just indescribable. This is them arguably leaving prog behind entirely and creating some hitherto unknown and hitherto not found again fusion of rock music and classical music that defies conventions of what rock music was at the time and just makes a new and interesting sound that is still unbelievably unique 47 years later. I mean, there are hints and glimmers of the old King Crimson on here, especially some of the middle tracks, like The Book of Saturday and Exiles, most obviously. But, you know, again, the opening and closing tracks, you know, Lark's 1 and Lark's Part 2, and then the talking drum and Easy Money, and it's just, I don't know, there's a reason I've never reviewed a lot of these albums, and that I don't know what to say about them. They're amazing. And so now you have observed me being a complete and utter drooling fanboy over the discography of King Crimson. A long time ago I was going to do a retro of these guys, but it never came to pass. I mean, I might in the future if I could get somebody to do it with me, but yeah, until then, I don't know when I'll talk about King Crimson again. I may do a review of The Construction of Light. I might not. I might leave it be. But either way, I will see you all later on the next weekly Album Spotlight.